leader. Hey, what do the following cities have in common? Okay, New York, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, Toronto, Mumbai, Istanbul. Well, all of these have had different names. They've changed names over the years. New York used to be New Amsterdam. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico used to be Hot Springs, New Mexico. Toronto was originally called York. Mumbai was called Bombay, and Istanbul was what? Constantinople. Well, this week we're going to be looking at another city that had a name change. Okay, we're going to be looking at that in a minute. Well, this is the last lesson in the unit that's called Irrefutable, Prophecies that Point Us to Jesus. This is the 6th lesson. It's called The Ruler Who Cares for His People. And these are verses out of Micah chapter 5, so go ahead and be finding that, as well as Matthew chapter 2. And the point of this lesson is that Jesus leads and cares for his people. I think I have a lot of background information here that might make your lesson this week a little more interesting. So we're looking here at the final Old Testament prophecy that we've been looking at for 6 weeks. It's in Micah chapter 5. And in verse 2 it says, "Out of you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, although you're small, out of you is going to come Israel's ruler." Well, first of all, the question may be, Bethlehem, we know that. Okay, we know little town of Bethlehem. We know about Bethlehem, but what's this Bethlehem Ephrathah? Well, first of all, practice saying that word. All right, you can always tell when somebody hasn't studied their lesson very well when they come in and the teacher stumbles over some of the words. Just practice that word. And I may not even be pronouncing it exactly correctly, but practice that. Bethlehem Ephrathah. Okay. Well, first of all, it's not like Dallas, Texas. All right. It's not like Bethlehem is a place and Ephrathah is like Judea or a larger place. It's not like that at all. Most likely, Ephrathah was the old Canaanite name for the area, meaning fruitful. And then it was renamed to Bethlehem, house of bread. Now we see in Genesis chapter 35 in verse 19, it says this, "So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath," that is Bethlehem. Okay. Ruth chapter 2, we'll see the sons of Naomi, and they're called Ephrathites from Bethlehem. And whenever Ephrathah or Ephrathites are mentioned in Scripture, it's always associated with Bethlehem. So here's the question. Why not just say Bethlehem? That's what most of the other places just reference Bethlehem. Well, I think it's to distinguish it from another Bethlehem. There's a Bethlehem of Galilee. Okay, that was about 6 miles from the city of Nazareth. Now, that's not uncommon to have the same names for cities in an area. Even today, like I live in Whitehall, Arkansas, and I think there are 3 Whitehalls in the state of Arkansas. All right. So today we think of Bethlehem as a popular place, okay, a booming, thriving place. It really wasn't so in Jesus' day. It's estimated that at the time of Jesus' birth, there was about anywhere from 300 to 1,000 people as residents there. Do you know any small towns like this? And maybe perhaps you grew up in one, or maybe you live in one now. Now, my wife, she's from a little town called Winoka, Oklahoma. It's in the northwest corner of the state of Oklahoma. Right now has less than 1,000 people. And so I always, in my mind, associate Bethlehem with Winoka because it's kind of just a little spot in the road. And so we think about the Messiah coming from this little spot in the road town, not from the royal place of Jerusalem or anything like that. And, but that's how God works, isn't it? He chooses the smallest and the weakest and the least significant to accomplish his purpose. All right. And so when we think of that song, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," that's true both of the size of Bethlehem and the significance of it. At the time, it really wasn't that significant, especially when you compare it to nearby Jerusalem. Now, true, King David was from Bethlehem, but this was going to be the birthplace of his greatest descendant. All right. Now, there in Micah, it talks about that this coming person, this Messiah, was going to be from origins of old, from ancient times. How can somebody be born in a place yet be old from ancient times? Well, that's where the God part of Jesus comes in, isn't it? The God-man is where he comes in. He was pre-existent from all eternity. All right, let's skip over now to Matthew chapter 2. And Matthew's gospel is the only place where we encounter the magi. Now, before we get into the magi, let's talk about the book of Matthew, okay? Who was the primary audience for Matthew's gospel? Well, it was the Jews. It starts off with the lineage in chapter 1 of Jesus. And this was to show that Jesus was from the line of David and from the line of Abraham. Okay, so you might want to go back and look at that. And remember what Bethlehem was also called what? The city of David. Now I want you to look at this chart here as I explain another way that Matthew showed that the Messiah was from the line of David. Now biblical Hebrew has no vowels, all right? It's just consonants. And if we wrote out the word David or David in Hebrew, it's very similar to how we would write it in English. It's written with 3 Hebrew letters, Dalet, Vav, and Dalet. And actually you can't tell here, but Hebrew actually reads right to left. And so we would transliterate that as DVD. All right, that's how we would write David if we were writing that with English letters in the Hebrew name, okay? Now Hebrew also used the letter's position in the Hebrew alphabet to indicate a number. So Dalet is the 4th letter. Now, just a little side note here, if you go to Psalm 119, most Bibles have above every 8 verses a Hebrew letter. First 8 verses, there's a little funny symbol, and then the word Aleph. That's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, then the second is Beit, then the third is Gimel, and then the 4th is Dalet. Okay? So, Dalet is number 4. Vav is the 6th letter, and Dalet, of course, is 4 again. You add those up, and you get to 14. Okay? Now, down in Matthew chapter 1, Matthew uses this when he writes that there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, and exile to the Messiah. So it's just another way that Matthew is proving to the Jews that Jesus truly is the Messiah. He was from the line of David. He was born in the city of David. All right, now let's talk about the Magi. Nothing in Scripture says that they were wise men or even that they were kings, but that they were Magi, okay? They weren't kings, but they counseled kings. So who were they? Were they astronomers? Were they astrologers? Well, yes, they were both. You know, astronomers, they study the planets and stars for scientific purposes, but astrologers study the planets and stars, and they look for and they interpret signs. And in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, it says that Magi from the east came. Now, I got out my Greek New Testament and looked it up, and right there, the word is Magi. M-A-G-I is how we would write that in English. And the Magi were this class of priests in ancient Media in Persia. And they were astrologers. They were sorcerers, okay? It's where we get the word magic or magician. Now, is this bothersome to you? Does this bother you that some of the first people to come and acknowledge that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was the King of the Jews, and they worshipped him? Does it bother you that these were magicians, that they were astrologers? Well, there again, to me it just shows that, and also they were Gentiles. They weren't even Jewish people. They were from far off. Well, it just, again, shows that Jesus came for all people, and he meets people where they are, okay? Well, how many were there? How many wise men or how many magi were there? Well, our tradition says how many? It says 3 because of the 3 gifts, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, the Bible doesn't tell us how many there were. Now, it uses plurals like the word men and they. So we had at least 2 or more. And in most of our modern day nativities, you have 3 wise men. You have a white guy, a black guy, and a brown guy. Most likely, though, they were all brown-skinned, okay? Probably from what we would call modern-day Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, that area. Because these 3 gifts that that came, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they were harvested or mined or whatever east of Israel in Arabia. So now let's talk about Herod. Okay, a little background about Herod. Herod the Great. Herod the First. He was the king of Judea from 37 BC to 4 BC, around that time. Before that, he was the governor of Galilee. Now, he's known for many great building projects, including the expansion of the Jewish temple. But he was a nasty guy. He was a mean dude. He ruled with an iron fist. And he was very paranoid. Very paranoid. He murdered his own wife, 3 sons, a daughter-in-law, 300 soldiers, and other relatives, because he was afraid that he was going to be usurped and have his kingdom taken away from him. Now, it was said it was better to be Herod's pig than one of his sons. Now, 5 days before his death, he ordered the death of his oldest son. Well, that's pretty cruel, isn't it? He also ordered that 2 of the leading rabbis of the area be burned alive. And when he did that, he realized, his death was imminent. He realized that no one was going to mourn at his death because of how cruel he was. So he ordered a bunch of notable Jewish folks to be rounded up. And he instructed that they were to be executed on his death, because then there would be mourning when he died. The Jewish folks would cry and wail and mourn this at the same time of Herod's death because of these Jewish folks who were executed. However, his sister Salome came along, and after Herod died, she reversed that order on his death. Now, ironically, Herod died on the Feast of Purim. Okay, and the Feast of Purim was to celebrate or commemorate the saving of the Jews from Haman, and we read about that in the book of Esther. So actually, when Herod died, there was much rejoicing, okay, because first of all, the feast was going on, and because the notable Jews were spared, and because of the death of Herod, okay. Now, so it wouldn't be a stretch at all that he would order the execution of baby boys under the age of 2 in Bethlehem that we see down in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Now, granted, that order is not mentioned in any historical records about that slaughter. But let's think about this. Bethlehem, remember, at the time of Jesus' birth, had a population of 300 to 1,000 people. And so the number of boys under the age of 2 was probably about anywhere from 6 to 10 at that time. And while even one baby being slaughtered was horrendous, that small number in such a small, insignificant village probably wasn't as newsworthy as some of his other stunts that I told you about. Now, very important, in the year about 40 or 39 BC, the Roman Senate appointed Herod King of the Jews. Okay, that was a title they gave him. And it's a title he didn't want to give up. So when the Magi came to him and asked, "Where is this one who has been born King of the Jews?" You can imagine how that set with Herod. This paranoid Herod was really threatened. In fact, the Bible tells us that he was disturbed. All right, so let's talk about that star, that bright star, Star of Bethlehem. What was this? Was this a combination of planets, or what was that? Well, based on chapter 2, verse 9, I tend to think it was something more supernatural than that. It says a star rose ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. So it moved. It moved as the Magi followed it. But whatever it was, the Magi followed it from Jerusalem to on to the 6 miles south to Bethlehem. Now, verse 10 indicates that the wise men were so full of joy that they were compelled to give. And their gifts weren't just trinkets, okay, but they were extravagant. They were costly goods from their homelands. And I'm afraid that instead of our first and our best, many of us tend to give our leftovers to God, to the church. All right. Now, beyond being impressive, these gifts also hinted about Jesus' identity. Gold, traditionally given as a gift for a king. And perhaps God provided this as a way to finance Mary, Joseph, and Jesus' journey down to Egypt until after the death of Herod. Then you have frankincense. This is a white tree resin. Signified Jesus' deity. It was cut from the bark of a tree. This gooey resin was collected and dried, and it was burned as incense in worship. It was highly fragrant when it was burned. And then myrrh. This was also a tree resin. It was a spice that was used in embalming, and it signified Jesus' humanity and his upcoming death. It was often mixed with wine and given to a person as they faced death to dull pain. We read about that in Mark chapter 15, verse 23. And then also in the embalming side, we read about Nicodemus in John chapter 19, verse 39. It talks about where he had 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes that he brought for the embalming of Jesus, which of course didn't take place. Now, do you know how myrrh was harvested? Okay, it wasn't like maple syrup where you stick a plug in the tree and put a bucket underneath it. The tree was actually wounded repeatedly by scoring the tree, by making the tree bleed, and the sap would drip down, and it's reminiscent of the beating of Jesus. So you get these gifts, the gifts for royalty, for deity, for humanity and death that signify all these things. That's the identity of Jesus. Well, afterwards, after they worshiped Jesus, the Magi chose not to go back to Herod as Herod instructed them to do. Instead, they went a different way. Now, for foreigners to disobey a king in that day, for anybody to disobey the king, and especially Herod, was very risky. But the Magi, by faith, followed the warning that they had received in a dream. They were clearly more awed by God than scared of Herod. See, God meets us where we are, doesn't he? They were dream interpreters. He spoke to them in a dream. Let's think about some of these things as we wind up this week. Even when presented with evidence, okay, not everyone's going to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. Chief priests, the teachers of the law, and even King Herod didn't do this. Also, Gentile astrologers were probably low on the list of religious folks, or anybody actually, who would acknowledge, let alone worship, a Jewish Messiah. Also, an encounter with Jesus should be worship and then giving. And even though Jesus is God and a king, he loves us. He cares for his people. And he's also a shepherd, just as the Micah and the Matthew passage state. He doesn't rule with an iron fist as Herod, but as Psalm 23 states, he rules with a rod and a staff, which are comforting. He guides and protects his flock. Yes, disciplines when necessary, but disciplines in love. So, don't forget to do what? Pray for and with your class. Hope you have a great new year.